My name is Jason Prince. I'm coordinator of a research action project. I'm your host tonight. Damaris Rose is a professor at the INRS, one of those other universities, and perhaps Canada's leading expert on housing issues, probably, arguably. Ted Rutland is a professor here at Concordia University in geography and urban studies. Recent to Montreal and very interested in urban planning. He's an urban planner, so he has this broader approach. And he's particularly interested in race issues and housing, I would say, and urban planning. So I'll let them fill in any blanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. My interest is mostly in sort of the history of planning. I'm more of a geographer than a planner. And some of the people in this film make a point that I think is really important, which is that the Pruitt-Igoe was symbolic of a much broader way of thinking about cities, city making, society, poverty, etc. And as well, the sort of dominant analysis of why Pruitt-Igoe failed has also been very widespread and has shaped the way a lot of people have thought about how to deal with poverty, how to deal with housing in contemporary cities. And so I think the film is really important for sort of giving us a really good analysis of Pruitt-Igoe and why it went wrong, which I think enables us to think about a whole bunch of other things. And so by way of some commentary, I'd like to sort of talk about two sort of logics or ideologies that I see in the making of Pruitt-Igoe and in the subsequent analysis of what went wrong. And I think we can see a continuity there that this film actually helps us to disrupt and to enable us to think about cities better. And so the first ideology is something called environmentalism. And by that I mean not environmentalism as we usually understand it, people who care about the environment, and rightly so, but it's sort of a logic that goes back to the early 1800s that has to do with believing that the environment around us has a major influence on us. It has an influence on our behavior, on our moral judgment, on our capacity to live an upstanding, productive kind of life. Connected to that is the idea that if you change the environment, you can change people. And so housing reform from the early 1800s straight through to projects like Pruitt-Igoe were usually based on the idea that if we can just put the poor in a different environment, we can solve the problem of poverty. So we don't have to change society, we can just put the poor somewhere else, and they'll become moral, upstanding people, and they won't be poor anymore. And of course, that project doesn't work very well, and Pruitt-Igoe is partly symbolic of the failures of that way of dealing with poverty. And the irony is that the supposed failure of Pruitt-Igoe takes forward that very same way of thinking. So what's wrong with Pruitt-Igoe was that it was the wrong environment. It didn't solve poverty. It's not the thinking that we can change people by moving into an environment. We just need to put them into a different environment. And so post Pruitt-Igoe, there's been a new way of thinking which has to do with getting poor people out of concentrated areas of poverty and putting them into areas of more social mix. Social mix usually just being a mix of wealthy people and poor people. And so we can see, and maybe Damaris might say more about this in the way it's been, happened in Montreal, but certainly the Right to the City group has been looking at the way that ideology has been put in play around Cabot Square and the redevelopment plans there. The idea is that we can deal with, there's some poverty there, and we can deal with it by sort of promoting revitalization, which is often a code word for gentrification. Bring in more wealthy people, and poverty will kind of disappear. So I think that this film, in showing us that there was a whole bunch of reasons why Pruitt-Igoe didn't quite work. It wasn't that the particular way, the built form of it, or the idea of good housing, these were not the reasons. And so I think the film can help us to think differently about the same problems that exist in our cities today. The second ideology, and I'll be more brief here, is something we could call paternalism. And paternalism as well goes back to the early 1800s, if not longer, but back to the 1800s in terms of the way that cities were thought about. And here just the idea is that poor people can't understand their own situations, they can't address the problems in their situations, and so they need other people to solve their problems for them. And here especially the film helps to undercut that logic. And you can see that the people who were interviewed, who lived in Pruitt-Igoe, they understand what's going on. They understand that they're poor not because they're lazy or failures, but because society is structured in a way that doesn't offer them opportunities. They're also able to understand what's going wrong in Pruitt-Igoe. They're organizing from these youth, proposing new models of how to organize space in Pruitt-Igoe, to these tenants associations that are organizing rent strikes, to the cleanup efforts after the flood, all kinds of ways in which people totally understand what's going on in a better way than people who don't live there, and are capable of working together to resolve their problems. And in this way, I think the film helps us, can be seen as part of a whole broader bunch of work that could be loosely grouped under the title of City Making from Below. And so there's a conference a couple years ago called The City from Below. The website still exists. A lot of the organizations and movements that came to present at that conference have become part of the Right to the City network in the United States. And they're movements of everyday people solving things for themselves. And I'll just finish with, there's a really great article that kind of summarizes this way of thinking by Andrea Gibbons called Driven from Below. And she talks about a whole bunch of tenants movements and housing movements that are driven by tenants. And Gibbons' argument is that these movements undercut really pervasive ideologies in capitalist society. You know, ideologies that have to do with poor people being poor because they've done something wrong. And that ideology can sometimes occur even in very well-meaning sort of organizations and advocacy bodies. But these movements sort of suggest that there's another way of doing things. And so all of this work, including this film, I think, can help us to think better about the problems of the past and chart a different way forward. And that's all I have to say. I'll pass it on to Damaris.
Great. Thank you for the invitation. Can you hear me to say a few words? This is the first time that I've seen this film, and so I'm not going to, I had to think about it a lot more before I could make direct comments appreciating the film and some of the points that it made. But what I would like to say is a few comments about the Montreal context, which Professor Rentisi specifically asked me to talk about in historical terms briefly in terms of different kinds of urban renewal. So urban renewal in Montreal goes back to about 1950 or a little earlier. It started later than it did in many other cities in Europe and indeed in North America. And I think it's helpful to think about different kinds of urban renewal, although as we saw in the film, they all end up getting linked together. I think there are some conceptual differences. First of all, we can think about mega projects, which would have two types of goals, one of which would be to improve the quote-unquote efficiency of urban form, typically through highway infrastructures, new expressways, interchanges, access roads to bridges, and so on and so forth. And in Montreal, we saw this with the Jacques Cartier Bridge, which was the beginning of the slum clearance in the area we now call the Centre Sud, when they built the roads to improve the access to the bridge, the Champlain Bridge, the Ville-Marie Expressway, and on a much smaller scale, the Park and Pine Interchange, which some of you may not know the story about, but it's a very important story actually about urban renewal and about urban renewal that was not fully achieved from the developer's point of view, and kind of a good news story in what could have been a very bad news story. A second kind of mega project involves new institutions that have as much of a symbolic value for the image of the great city, for putting a city on the world map, as they are a contribution to the city's economy and its cultural development. Montreal's most famous mayor, Jean Drapeau, who some of you may have heard of, was very big on this type of mega project. And it's a long list. It would take me more than 5 minutes to go through all of them. But let's just mention the Maison Radio-Canada, which finished up the job as regards Centre Sud, Complexe des Jardins, the Olympic installations in the East End, and many others. The second type of urban renewal, which is what we heard more about in the film, amounts to slum clearance and rehousing either in situ or elsewhere. Of course, as we saw in the movie, the two types are very much linked because slum clearance has often been used as a justification for changing the use of an area from housing to non-residential or higher profit residential use. Expressways and interchanges broke up the fabric of neighborhoods everywhere in cities all over the world. And they led to the deterioration of these neighborhoods, providing local governments with justification for slum clearance. This happened in the Centre district, for example. And again, I'll get back to my little example of the Park and Pine interchange. It was after that was built that the advisors moved in from the Ford Foundation and said, this neighborhood is deteriorating, it's a slum, you have to raise it to the ground, and the developers moved in, and so on and so forth. In Montreal, we don't have very many examples of large-scale slum clearance and rehousing. It's probably because state intervention in working-class housing began late in Montreal compared to US and European cities, late 1940s, 1950s, and by the time they really got going with it, it was kind of out of fashion and no longer acceptable, so they moved on fairly quickly to a mixture of redevelopment and rehabilitation, or more of a straight rehabilitation approach, which is what is normally used today, with certain exceptions. There was only one really important example of modernist high-rise and semi-high-rise public housing in Montreal ever built, and it was the Habitation Jeannance. And compared to what we see in many other cities, it's minuscule. If you talk about Habitation Jeannance as a grand ensemble to somebody from France, they'll laugh at you, completely laugh at you. But by our standards, it's big. That project almost didn't happen because Mayor Jean Drapeau didn't like it. He didn't approve of rehousing French-Canadian families in the central city. He thought that would be unhealthy. It did, in fact, end up happening for a series of complicated reasons. The other case was Little Burgundy, which was done later, and this was smaller scale and lower density. There were actually more new houses built on that site than there were homes demolished, so there was a net gain rather than actual displacement. However, new problems developed. The area rapidly became far less socioeconomically diverse than the original neighborhood used to be. And this happened inadvertently on account of the policy decisions made by the Public Housing Authority about the rent levels in the public housing. Basically, they abolished the rent ceiling, so 25% of some people's income was quite high, and they decided that they would move to other neighborhoods like NDG, and this led to many increased concentration of poverty in Little Burgundy and other problems, which of course have been worked on since to improve the situation. In the past 15 years or so, public housing complexes have been torn down all over Europe as well as in the USA. More examples of beyond Pruitt-Igoe, many other complexes have been torn down in a new phase in the US since about the mid-1990s under a program called Hope 6. They have been replaced all over the place by mixed tenure, mixed income developments. There is always displacement involved, and in the USA, conditions are imposed on the low-income people who want to come back. You must get a job, no welfare families. The research findings are very mixed as to resident satisfaction and their quality of life. We have a good example of a comment that was made right at the end about public housing actually being very varied and very fine-grained. The good news we can say, from one point of view, is that the Habitation Jeannance seems completely safe from redevelopment. Although it has problems, there have been a great deal of effort to develop supportive services and activities to get residents, most of whom are now immigrants from the global south, involved in local activities. There is a nice little film about Habitation Jeannance whose name escapes me, but I saw it last year in another context, and it really shows how that kind of public housing can be a very supportive environment for the parents and also for the kids growing up, although you can't be Pollyanna-ish about it either. Finally, Habitation Jeannance has a huge waiting list, which shows A, that it can't be all bad, and B, that there are many difficulties with affordable housing in Montreal.
Okay, thank you.